General, it's great to have you on CNBC.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so walk me through how you see the situation on the ground today in Ukraine.
Well, I've said several times today, and in my remarks, I pointed out that I think we're seeing a fundamental shift in the war. Clearly, Russia has already suffered defeats north of Kyiv, strategically defeated and had to retreat. But now we're in a phase where they're actually going to be taking back land that they've held before. And we are pushing east of the Dnieper River into areas that, as you heard Mr. Putin declare, were his the other day in his famous speech. So I believe that on the ground, Ukraine has now started in motion what many, even here today, have referred to as an unchangeable momentum now towards expelling Russia from the country. And so the fundamental shift to me is not really about what's happening on the ground, but I think the fundamental shift now is what is threatening Russia. Because while this may not be an existential fight for Russia and the Russian people, I believe it's an existential fight for Mr. Putin. And I think that's the fundamental change now as he starts to lose ground against those things that he thinks are so important to him.
It's fascinating to watch the narrative out of the Kremlin, especially in recent days, the now threat on the table of nuclear warfare. Do you believe it's a credible threat?
Well, 2 months ago, I would have told you that it's credible, but highly unlikely. Now I would tell you that it's credible, and the possibility is more than it was 2 months ago. So it appears I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth, but we have to understand that Mr. Putin and his generals, General Gerasimov and others, have been writing about nuclear weapons for a long time, and their fundamental statement is that nuclear weapons are a logical extension of the conventional battlefield. And every Zapad exercise, and you know Zapad stands for West, every Zapad exercise in the war termination phase exercises nukes against an aggressive NATO. And so I think what they write about, what they speak about, what they practice, we have to take seriously. I still do believe, though, that Mr. Putin understands that this is really different. Even though he says it's a logical extension of the conventional battlefield, I think he knows that that's not how the West sees it. And I think he has to understand that we would see this as a very different approach to war.
President Zelensky has suggested once again that the Ukrainian people are ready to join NATO. Would it be a mistake for NATO to allow them access at this point?
So let's just make a couple of judgments. One thing I learned is the SAC year was not to speak for the political side of NATO, so I will avoid that. But as a military leader, Ukraine's military has come a long way. They have learned from us. We trained for them for years, trained with them for years at Yavriv, which is just over the Polish border by about 20 kilometers. And their army is approaching working to NATO standards. There's still some work to do. There's still work to do in their Navy and their Air Force. But this is a nation that has come a long way. And oh, by the way, aren't you proud of how their military has performed? So I think, if you'll allow me just to make a judgment in a military sense, once we get this issue with Russia resolved, I believe they should be given the chance.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that you say that, because last year I interviewed Vladimir Putin for 2.5 hours live from Moscow, and one of the questions I asked him was about NATO. He said NATO is an aggressor. We have trust deficit with NATO. And another question I asked him was about arms, and he said, well, we've been in an arms race since the United States failed to re-sign the START treaty. Do you think that if we take a step back and look at this from a historical perspective, is there any ground that we can give him in terms of, he terms it NATO aggression, but certainly there was NATO enlargement, and in terms of missiles and defense and arms, were there decisions made on our side that should have been different?
Well, you're asking the wrong person, having been the commander of NATO. Let me offer you my opinion.
Yeah.
I was in NATO when there were 28 nations. And for 3 years, I sat in meetings. And what few know is that at the big summits and other meetings, everything is rather scripted and everything sort of moves. Everybody knows what everybody's doing. There's rarely any big surprises. But at every one of those meetings, they have a dinner. Very small attendance. The SACEUR was always at the table. And that is the unscripted dinner.
Off-record.
Off-record, unscripted dinner.
Yeah.
And that is where I saw so many conversations about nations like Montenegro joining or not joining, Georgia joining or not joining. And here's what I saw, just my observation of those conversations. It is extremely hard to get into NATO. Nations try for years, and it is very, very hard. And watching the conversations, there is this perception out there in the world that NATO is enlarging and it's out there grabbing nations and pulling them into NATO. It is the farthest from the truth that you can imagine. These nations are clamoring to get into NATO, and they are getting the stiff arm for years and years and years.
Including Ukraine.
Exactly. And so I don't sign up to this NATO enlargement and we're crashing against the borders of Russia. Yeah. No, exactly the opposite. What happened is former Russian states are fighting to get away from Russia and join NATO. And so I just push back on that enlargement theme all the time.
Do you think then that we're going to see Ukraine fast-tracked into the NATO alliance as a result of their performance on the battlefield?
Well, the demonstrated history of NATO is they are not going to bring a nation in that is in the middle of a border dispute or has occupied land. They're not going to bring them in, because then the whole alliance is committed to go straight to Article 5. And so until this issue with Russia occupying Ukrainian land is over, I don't think there's going to be a fast track. I support it. I applaud Mr. Zelensky, but I'm just being a realist. Until the dispute over land with Russia is over, I don't see it happening.
General, thank you for joining CNBC.
Thank you.